Hi everyone, this is our LGBTQ plus panel discussion, and this is for LGBTQ plus History Month campaign. These are the guests for this panel discussion. We have Avery and Megan from NUS Liberation and Ryan from CETMA. Avery, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Avery. I'm a third year psychology student at the University of Central Lancashire. I'm the trans place on the NUS kind of liberation campaign group, and I'm also the trans rep at my university. I've been doing this for the last couple of years now, and I'm about to graduate, so it's going to be sad to see it go, but there we go.
Hi, my name's Megan. I use any pronouns. I have graduated already, but last year I was the LGBT plus network lead at Huddersfield Students' Union alongside my final year of studies, and I'm the LGBTQ plus students place on the NUS Liberation board. I've also very recently gotten a role on the board of trustees of York LGBT Forum, and I'm currently an activities and events coordinator at a really great sensory loss charity in York called the Wilberforce Trust.
Hello, my name's Ryan. I'm the publications editor for CETMA, which stands for Community Engagement, Technology, Media and Arts. We've been involved in various LGBTQ plus related events over the past decade or so. We were actually responsible for the first Pride event in Connectley, and we hope to continue going with as much as possible for many years to come.
Great, thank you so much. So for this panel, we're looking at covering topics around accessibility, LGBTQ plus rights, and inclusive practices. A few questions that I've had. So I've asked students for questions for this panel, and I have received a few, which I think most of all, we would like to focus on what it means to be an ally and how can we be allies.
There's that, like, I think when this question's raised in a lot of these kind of circles, there's like the generic response of, allyship is about speaking out when there's hate and like supporting people and individuals who are going through differences in their lives, whether they're trans and they're having to go through a transition, or if they're gay and they're trying to understand like where they can access their community. But I think it's also now at a point where it's like a necessity now, because we're seeing such negativity all over the place, especially towards the trans community, and it's one of those like necessary steps now. I don't necessarily believe everyone should be an activist. I don't think necessarily everyone shouting out is going to be very helpful, but like, just like, obviously there is the supporting people, there's making sure that the communities are there, making sure they are cared for, whether it's societies at universities, for example, and then it's little things like it's teaching a friend. If a friend is a little unsure about something, you can talk to them about it. If a lecturer says something that you think might be questionable, they are generally quite accepting to feedback and stuff like that. So especially in a university setting, there's so many little things you can do, and those little things all add up towards like the greater goal of allyship and a better communities in our universities.
Yeah, I think to carry on from that as well, one of the most important aspects of allyship at the moment is listening, being willing to take feedback from your LGBT friends, colleagues, celebrities, maybe even talking about the issues that they face, being willing to learn and being willing to put potentially what you didn't realise were prejudices aside. I think another major important part of it is like Avery said, the smaller parts of just speaking up if someone says something slightly wrong, of just re-educating someone, using your voice for good in the ways that you might not necessarily even think about day to day, is one of the most important parts of allyship you can do. Because often it can be really exhausting as an LGBT person to constantly correct people, to constantly report things, to constantly speak up and use your voice. So if you as an ally can use your voice for that, it's always massively helpful.
I couldn't really say that any better than the two of you already have. Anecdotally, I suppose I'd add as well as having the humility to listen when you may have unconscious biases, because we can't all be all things to all people at once, of course. We find that just providing a space where people can vent their frustrations has been immensely helpful as well, especially given the rising negativity politically in the world. But yes, beyond that, listen, learn, and feedback what you can.
Absolutely, and like I suppose adding on to bits of what Megan said about the small parts, because I mentioned the small parts, Megan built on that. we have, I think there's, when it comes to like allyship, people get worried that they have to be on a stage shouting out, they have to be at a protest, they have to be at a march, they have to be doing these really big things, but it's not necessarily for everyone. And like the help is massively appreciated, but it's kind of the little things you do every day that feel like they're being unnoticed. But like, I know when people do tiny things for me, I think about it for the next month. It's one of those things where the tiny bits are so important, and don't put too much pressure on yourself to be an ally. It can be something that you can do, and like subconsciously you can, it might take a bit of conscious effort, you know, saying something or doing something, but generally over time that becomes your behavior, that becomes just normal, it becomes a subconscious natural thing, and you end up becoming just an ally without having to think about it. You don't always need to be thinking about, what do I have to do to further the cause, what do I have to do for this? You can just be you and be helpful and be a good person generally. I think that's a key message.
I think that is a actually very good point to make as well. Just being a supportive presence and not speaking for or over people. It can be an easy habit to fall into if you're trying to make a presence out there.
I suppose for me, the most important part of being an ally is being able to listen and provide that safe space for someone. Because I think, you know, even based on my own experiences, the most important thing is feeling safe, and like having that feeling of safety and knowing that, you know, there's someone I can speak to. They might not necessarily relate to what I'm saying, but they're willing to listen and to not judge me. Do you think you could share examples of any successful LGBTQ plus initiatives, whether student-led or in any social settings?
So when I was the LGBT plus network lead at Huddersfield, one of the things I was really passionate about is finding the small parts of the policies that were impacting people on the ground. So I was trying to, across the year, pick apart everything, try and find something that I could improve, because overall, a lot of LGBT students at Huddersfield were reporting that they felt safe on campus, that they felt positively supported, they felt like lecturers understood. And so I was really trying to get down to those nitty-gritty details. And I actually accidentally found it out. So someone that I know was a couple of years below me, was applying to go to university and had applied to go to Huddersfield, and actually received a letter from the University of Huddersfield with their dead name on it, despite on NUS putting down that they had a preferred name, despite all the documentation saying their preferred name, because they hadn't legally changed it. All their letters they were receiving were in their old name. For them, this didn't put them in any danger. It was just a mild inconvenience. They brought it up offhandedly, that it was really frustrating that had happened. And it got me thinking about the fact that the other universities that applied to were referring to them with their preferred name, and that they had this information, they had the preferred name, and they just weren't using it. And so I spoke to the registry team at Huddersfield, and I found out that it was actually Huddersfield policy to always refer to applicants and graduates and current students with their legal name in official communication. So over email, on Teams, it could all be changed to your preferred name. You didn't need a deed poll or anything like that, but official communications always had to be in your legal name. And working with the registry team and with the Students' Union, we got this changed towards the end of my time at Huddersfield. So that means that all applicants, all graduates, all current students, every letter they get home, everything will always be in their preferred name that is on their file. And for me, that was just a massive win. It's one of those things that you don't really think about. My preferred name is my birth name, so I would have never known that personally. My friends who have changed their name have deed polls, so they would have never found that out. I think that was a really, really successful initiative for me, because that is such a small thing to change, and it was relatively easy in the grand scheme of things, but it's going to make a massive difference for students in the future as well.
I mean, that's brilliant. And I think, unfortunately, I've seen that at a lot of universities, that being like the policy. I'm not going to talk about what I think you think I'm going to talk about. One thing I've noticed that I've not done myself, so there we go, it's no longer my impressive campaign, is like gender affirmation funds. And they've been amazing. I've seen them all across the country now, and they're gaining a lot of momentum. And it's where like a union or a university will provide a little bit of funding to the side to provide gender affirming clothing, gender affirming binders and packers, the kind of stuff that like makes someone comfortable to be themselves. And I've seen them all across the country, sometimes led by students, sometimes led by presidents and vice presidents, sometimes led by the universities themselves. And I think that is an initiative that probably just started in one university. I don't know the history of where it started, unfortunately, but it's probably just something that started in one university and it's spread. I know our university is now considering it, and that's a really big win. Other campaigns, from my experience as someone who's led a campaign, now I'm talking about the campaign, Megan, is my campaign to ban conversion therapy in the UK, which is something I started off as one of those government petitions. It was ignored again and again and again and again. There's so many petitions, so many campaigns on it. And so we decided to have a physical in-person campaign where we decided to get these postcards. I wish I had a sample one to show you. We had these postcards and got students to sign them, and then we send them to the members of parliament completely for free. Last academic year, we got 1,000 of them signed at 12 partner institutions. This year, we've sent another 1,600 out to other partner, I think 16, 17 at partner institutions. And it's one of those incredible things where there's now going to be thousands of pieces of paper. Now, environmental impact's not great, but we've tried to make it as sustainable as we can. And like that's going to be a physical thing to pressure members of parliament. So making change and these kind of initiatives, they don't need to just be your university. Absolutely, if you have the ambition and you have the time, because taking care of yourself is so important, if you have the time and you have the ambition, absolutely go national. We took our policy to the National Union of Students Conference, and that was voted on pretty much unanimously. And that was terrifying presenting it. I'd never done a speech to that many people before. I'd never done policy work that complex before. But the reward at the end, when you see that vote share, you see thousands of people have voted for this thing, and now a national body supports a ban for conversion therapy, supports access to healthcare, supports all of these things. It's really rewarding. So I suppose that's not necessarily a successful initiative in the sense that we've got what we wanted, but we now have the momentum because of that initiative starting at a few different partner institutions. And that's really, really nice to see.
I think that's really important to note as well, that not everything you do is going to happen really, really quickly. I think my example is something that I had a really supportive university that were really, really happy to hear me out about why they wanted to change this. But when you're trying to change something at government level, it's going to take time. It's going to take years, potentially hundreds of thousands of people, as Avery was saying, getting involved, joining in. It's going to take a while to push, especially when it's something that the government isn't on their plate of priorities. It's going to take time, and it's about ensuring that, like Avery said, you're taking care of yourself and you're able to let other people stand in, let other people help, let other people push this with you, because it'll get to a point where it's bigger than you, and then you won't necessarily have the energy to push it yourself anymore. So I think one of the really important things is relying on other people and learning that you can't take it all on yourself, which is something I'm still trying to learn. So
it is really hard to let go of a big campaign and give other people that control, because it's your child. You've nurtured it. You've seen this amazing thing formed, and you've seen some successes. You've seen the failures in it, but you absolutely have to let other people take bits and pieces of it, because I would not be able to get this done to 17 partner institutions and this many postcards and sort it out by myself. I'm doing my dissertation this year. I've got to look after that, and that's really important. So absolutely resonate with what Megan said.
I think a lot of people who do activist work are volunteers. I was really lucky in that my students' union had a lot of funding and I got paid for my job, but I only got paid for 7.5 hours a week, and I can't change the world on my own in 7.5 hours a week. And I'm sure everyone doing student activism feels like there's just never enough hours, there's never enough time. That's always what happens. And I think being able to know your limits in a campaign is massively important, and it's ultimately what's going to make it so successful.
Definitely. And I think one of the things that was mentioned, and I just wanted to kind of reiterate that, I think is very wholesome how, when you start a campaign and so many people come together to support that cause. And I think it's a very beautiful feeling. And just to, get that sense of community, and, we're all fighting together for the same thing, for acceptance, for inclusivity, to make a better world overall. And I just think that's a very great thing.
One of the things that I've seen the Senators do and that our organisation has done ourselves is get more grassroots pride going and establishing smaller groups in more rural areas. Anecdotally, again, we've done pride events in smaller towns in rural West Wales and had a surprising amount of positive resonance, and having residents walk up and say, I never thought I'd see something like this in my town. It is a good feeling to have, and it's a good practice to keep going. So yeah, from that perspective, I'd call more of that going on a successful endeavour. Hopefully the Senate will carry on with it as well.
I know where I come from, the small town of Belper. Shout out to Belper in the middle of the East Midlands. We've started having small prides there, and they've like people from across the region have been coming to this small town now because it's got that reputation. So like it also just helps the like local community, and not only like the queer community but like the wider community, because we've never had so many people coming to a small town apart from when the Monster Raving Loony Party has its conference there. That's the only time we get that kind of level of people. So having pride events all like in the rural areas, coming from someone who lived and grew up in a rural area, I'm really happy to hear that's happening, and it's so helpful, really helpful.
Great, thank you so much, all. My next question is around inclusivity. So, what can universities and student unions do to create more inclusive and accessible spaces for LGBTQ plus students, especially those with disabilities?
I think for me, I mentioned this before, that a lot of student activists are volunteers and are running on hopes and a dream and a very, very small budget for what they want to do, if they get a budget at all. I think one of the main things that universities could really be doing is supporting students' unions monetarily to pay their staff and their volunteers well. I could not have done what I did in university. I could not have had my volunteer position if I wasn't paid for it, because I was in the unfortunate position where I couldn't afford university. I couldn't afford to live there if I didn't have a part-time job. And I wouldn't have had time to do my degree, to do my my activism work, to be part of the societies, run the societies I wanted to do, and have a part-time job. One of them would have had to go, and unfortunately it would have had to have been the student activism. I think universities really, really underestimate how burnt out students are a lot of the time. And I'm sure we really all relate to the idea that we feel like we could be doing more, but we just can't. We get home after a long day and all we want to do is just sleep, or we go to a class and we feel like we can't focus because we've got so much else going on. I was enabled to do everything I did because of the pay that I received, and that should be a standard for every students' union. And if it isn't, then the university should be stepping in and helping with that. There should be funding pathways to help with that. And I just think it's a really good place to start, to ensure that the staff you have, the volunteers you have, they aren't going to run themselves into the ground helping other students, because no one can make anything from burnout. It will always, always, always come crashing down, even if it's years in the future, even if it's now. Something will always happen. Something's always got to give. And to prevent that, I think universities could be doing a lot more to fund student unions and the fantastic things that they do.
I'm going to reiterate a point that I've heard a lot from Eddie from NUS, who is doing what we do, but for disabilities and accessibility. When you're hosting events, when you're doing socials, when you're doing forums, an amazing thing to have, and I hope he's proud of me for saying this, an amazing thing to have is like a checklist for accessibility. So to like figure out how many different things contribute to having a fully accessible space, write them down. It might take you a couple hours, and it might take some consultation to get it done, but once it's done, it is done. And then when you have an event, consult your checklist, see where it goes, and see what you can do to tick more of those boxes. And to communicate with that with students is really helpful as well, because at National Union of Students Conference, for example, there were people in wheelchairs who couldn't really get around very easily. There were people who needed interpreters and they didn't get them. And it was a mess because we didn't necessarily have those provisions in place. That's really helpful. On the point of like neurodivergency as well, I think student unions have a tendency to do a lot of music and alcohol-based stuff. That's not great for everyone. I know a lot of people who get very overwhelmed when there's people drinking around. They might have had certain experiences in that. When there's loud music around, they might struggle to have that kind of social interaction. So it's to ensure that you know your demographics, you know who the people you're catering for are, and making sure you can best accommodate them. And in our representation structures, across student unions across the country, student unions are generally have a lot of white participation. Like we are generally, unfortunately, there's a lot more white people and a lot more people from UK home setting doing representation roles and participating in those structures, when in reality that doesn't reflect the demographic of our universities. So we need to ensure that we are reaching out to those communities. And I'm saying this as a white person, and I understand that like I might not know how to fix that problem, but to ensure we know who the demographics are, because our community is a lot more diverse than we think it is sometimes. And when I host a social or when I do a get together, it's all white LGBT students. But we do have that community. So we need to make sure we've got the right ideas for bringing that engagement and making sure everyone is comfortable. The answer to that, I'm not sure how to fix that, what the solution is, because that's not a community I'm impacted by. But to reach out to the people who are engaging and see what they would like, see what they need.
I think building on from something you said as well, I think it's really important with these checklists to remember that nothing can ever be fully 100% accessible, because there is always access needs that clash, and that's okay. I think bearing that in mind and not being afraid of that fact is really, really important. Not being afraid to offer different alternatives to make different events accessible for different people. Not being afraid to consult with the people who are planning to come to this and saying, what accessibility features do you need would make you feel more comfortable. A really good example of this is at Huddersfield. I really benefited from a disabled students open day they did before I started at the university. And it was absolutely fantastic, but it wasn't massively accessible for autistic people, which I am. It was really, really loud. The day wasn't as organised as I would have liked it to be. It was really difficult to get answers out of anyone about what to do. It was a very free structure for quite a lot of it. We were supposed to go up and speak to different people, and that really didn't suit me. And as a result of that, they actually created a separate day. So they had a disabled students induction day and an autistic students induction day. And that was and then that was then expanded to different neurodivergent conditions as well. And that was to ensure that everyone that came had the best possible chance of getting the access that they needed out of that day to prepare them for university, to prepare them for the change. And that was all based off of student feedback. And so I think within your remit, when you can, not being afraid to offer different alternatives instead of trying to make a one size fits all is really, really important.
Obviously, bearing in mind I'm not and never have been a university student, but when hosting any kind of event or delivering anything to service users, we always see it as a collaborative process, asking them what they want that we can enable. So basically, I just reiterate everything that was just said.
It all links back to what we said about just listening. You know, it's that allyship to our, not only just to the LGBT community separately, but there's a lot of crossover. It's being an ally to all of the communities that need that support. The main key principle, you just have to listen.
Definitely. Thank you so much, all. This year, as a sabbatical officer, this is my first year, by the way. I've been doing a lot of work around accessibility and working with registry, because at Trinity, trans students get called by their dead names for graduation ceremonies. Trans rights means a lot to me. And this is something that's been ongoing, that I've been working on, and as well as accessibility for disabled students across all campuses. So thank you for answering that question. It's a question that is very dear to me, that I always discuss with. It's so important that, you know, everything that we try to make things as accessible as possible, so that, you know, everyone can participate in it, so that everyone has that chance, you know. But thank you. My next question is around, well, still around inclusivity, but as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, life can be potentially isolating from some instances. What strategies would be effective in combating loneliness and fostering community?
I think it's really important to find your own communities, especially at university. It's really, really scary to go from, you know, living at home, doing all of that stuff, to go to university. Even if you're commuting, it's a massive change. You know, you are suddenly, quote unquote, a real adult. You know, you're going into the real world, especially if you're going into university straight from sixth form or college. I think putting in the effort, as scary as it can be, to find the people that you resonate with, to seek them out, even if it's not through a specific LGBT network or society, through the different societies you go to. Find the people in class that are interested in the same things as you. Chat to a lecturer and ask them if they know of any different societies. Go to your students' union, speak to your representatives. Find out what there is on offer for you that you can get involved in, even if you only go once and you decide that it's not for you. You've made that effort and you've put that in, and it is terrifying to do it for the first time. I commuted for my first year of university, and I had friends in my class, but I had no friends outside of that because I didn't go to anything ever. I wasn't involved in my students' union. I didn't do anything. And I really, really regret that, because then when I moved to university and I got my part-time job at the Students' Union in second year, I didn't know anyone. I didn't know what we were supposed to be doing. I didn't know any of the societies that were on offer. I didn't know any of the things that my student union did. And that meant that I was really behind compared to a lot of the other people in the Students' Union in making those friendships and building those bonds. And if I could go back, I would tell myself that as much as it's terrifying, you have to put yourself out there, even in the slightest ways. Even if you go to the art society and you sit in the back and you draw and you go home, you are socializing, you are taking one step closer to being more confident in yourself and more confident in speaking to other people. And I think the way that universities and student unions could support this is making sure there's a wide variety of things on and encouraging those organisations and those groups and those societies to, as we said before, publicise their accessibility, publicise exactly what they will be doing, talk about, what happens at a session, what is there to expect, what different sessions do we have on, and give people the chance to feed into those societies as well, to make sure that there is things and sessions that they're interested in going to. And that would really, really impact the way that a lot of, especially first year students, would feel welcome in going to those events.
Obviously, our community often does have issues with isolation for various reasons. The typical enough growing up thinking you might be the only one, that kind of business. But what doesn't get talked about as much, I find, is isolation in the older part of our community. We specifically do target a lot of our events and regular socials at the 55 plus crowd because so many of them are isolated. So just extending that kind of space to the older crowd, making them, we've heard it anecdotally from a lot of our service users. They've turned aside from one group or another going, oh, it's a young person's crowd, they won't want us there, that kind of thing. So being very overt that you're creating a presence for people of a certain age can go a long way to combating what's really quite bedded in isolation. And it doesn't take much before you can see a massively positive effect from just having a space where people can gather of a certain age, and they have the same cultural references, they have the same experiences growing up in a way that people of a younger generation didn't necessarily have. So yes, just being aware that different age groups will have to an extent different needs, and being able to cater that is important to combat loneliness as well, I think.
Point that Ryan made around different age groups is very useful, because especially with Trinity, we've got campuses across 2 different countries. So we've got campuses in Wales and we've got campuses in England, and the demographics are different. And on some campuses, we have more mature students than we have on other campuses, which is always very empowering, like to see people returning to education. And I think, it's always important to be able to have that type of support and have, be inclusive, like to mature students, and understand that mature students might want to partake in certain events, but they feel like it might not be appropriate due to their age. So I just think that, thank you, Ryan, for making that point. I think that it was very useful.
I'm really glad to hear about what Ryan's talked about, because we have gender outreach workers from people who work within the gender identity service, and they come over and they talk to people and help them out. And they come to our university to just host their space for trans people, but it's not specifically for students. And because it's hosted in a university space, but it's not necessarily, it's just a community event, we have people as young as 17 attending, and as old as, let's say, in their 60s. So, being that kind of, our identities can bring us together as long as we know the correct way to facilitate that. So what helped with that is the fact that it's people who are trained professionals who are both trans, and they've had that experience and they have fully transitioned, and they have the medical knowledge as well. So that really helped there. At university levels, also, mature student societies are a godsend. They are really, really helpful. I hear a lot of mature students absolutely love them, but it is, again, harder to participate because there's certain responsibilities that come with not being a young 19-year-old like me. I'm 21 now. Oh my God. Being a 21-year-old running around with no cares in the world. There are certain pressures there. But a story, and when it comes to loneliness in general, the story I like to tell a lot because it's personal, it's from my experience, is my first year of uni. I moved in the day the Queen died. That was one hell of a start to my university experience. But I moved in, and my student union hosted a social where you could come and get a free burger and come and socialize and drink. I went and attended and realized I don't know anyone. There was no one there, and there were loads of people there who had all formed their groups, but because I came a little bit late, they were already in their groups, and I had a panic attack, and I went home crying. That was awful, but the day after, I was so glad I actually tried it. And then I joined the LGBT society, I joined the trans society, and I started attending their socials. I found my community, I found my space, and that was a lot easier to talk to those people. I went from having no one at all to, at the end of my first year, having a really, really solid group of friends. We were out every night. Not great for my bank account, but it was great for my mental health, and it made me have a community. I went from this nervous wreck to, in second year, presenting a policy at the National Union Students' Conference in front of thousands of people. And the fact that you can go from having a panic attack and crying because you don't know anyone there to presenting a policy to thousands of strangers in the space of a year and a half is something that really hits home with me, because that change can be quick. That change can happen. And it's really scary, and you do have to force yourself into it. But you'll be so, so glad you've done it, because the position I'm in now it's changed my life in the most positive way possible. I mean, Google knows I exist. That's insane. So these kind of things, you do have to force yourself, and it's not going to be pleasant maybe the first time, but you're going to be glad the day after, a month after, 3 years after, in my case, that you've done it. And that's really important.
Next question is around LGBTQ plus rights. I would like to assign this more to Avery and Megan, because I wanted to focus it more on a university setting. So how have LGBTQ plus rights progressed within universities, and what do you think needs to be done to ensure equity for all students?
So I think generally in the university space, we have seen things get better. We're looking at a crumbling world around us on this issue, where it's becoming very toxic and becoming very hostile very quickly. And it can become very scary. And it's okay to be scared in this situation, because fear can motivate you if harnessed correctly. But I'd say in the university space, we're going in the right direction. And that's really, really promising sign, because university, at the end of the day, we are going into the next step to becoming fully functioning members of society, or at least partially functioning members of society. And we have that space, we have that environment that fosters a good attitude, a good mentality towards each other. So in universities, we're going the right way. There is pushback sometimes in the media. There's pushback sometimes within members of staff in universities. But as a general rule, we're going the right way. I think the activist space now is also ramping up quite a lot. I've seen so many more people volunteering themselves to do representation work, to do advocacy work. It has to be student-led, because these students are the ones who are living it every day, and they know what is best for them and what the university should be doing necessarily, because some staff who are getting paid quite a bit of money might not necessarily know the answer. And so although we're in a scary environment, university is kind of like a bastion for a positive development of LGBT rights. We need to keep that going and not be scared when we're confronted, because we're not going to counter the international wave of hatred by backing down and by compromising. it's one of those things where, you know, we're taught to compromise, but sometimes when it's talking about comfort, when it's talking about rights, you can't back down. And it's one of those awful things where you'll probably feel a little bad doing it. You know, these strict, really strict, assertive conversations can be difficult, but generally we're going in the right direction. We need to keep that going because now the pressure is on us and we have to push against it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I don't know how much anyone knows about Huddersfield usually, because it's a very small northern, traditionally textiles town, and there can be some quite backwards attitudes in Huddersfield in the student body. So we have a massive population of commuter students at Huddersfield. We have more commuter students than we have students that live at university. And that's because of the fact that Huddersfield is really affordable. The people that are going to university around Huddersfield are going specifically because the university is really close to them. And that means that there can be people there who potentially don't necessarily have the most educated views on LGBT people. However, something that I've seen is they're still massively respectful, regardless of what views they've grown up with, regardless of what they might have been taught growing up from various different places, regardless of how little they know or them just having never met an LGBT person before that they know of, or never having felt the need to educate themselves. The fact that they're so respectful towards what we do as activists, the fact that they're not necessarily curious, but they keep a distance, but they're kind and they just allow you to exist. And that is the bare minimum, I will admit. But for a small Yorkshire town, it's a lot more than I could ever ask for. The fact that the amount of people I had coming up to me, I did a stall where I gave out free broccoli, which is a very long story. But the amount of people that I had coming up to me and then realizing after speaking to me that it was an LGBT stall and being genuinely curious about LGBT History Month, about what that means, about what I'm doing, what my job is, the things that I've done to further LGBT rights, even if they didn't necessarily understand, was amazing. The response that we got from that was fantastic. And I think it's really important to further these conversations by answering these questions. I think I'm personally in a really good position of privilege where I will answer any question about my identity. And if I don't feel comfortable answering it, I will tell them why I don't feel comfortable answering it. And I'll explain to them why it's potentially an offensive question or why it's a question they shouldn't go and ask someone that's potentially not as patient as me, to ensure that they don't put themselves in danger by asking that, because often it just genuinely comes from a place of curiosity. And I think rewarding that curiosity by either giving them an answer or giving them an explanation as to why they're not getting an answer is really important. It's going to continue to further the understanding. As I said, though, my university were fantastic with everything LGBT, with the furthering of rights. They were really, really receptive to the changes I wanted to make. We ran the first ever official Trans Day Remembrance Vigil at Huddersfield, and they were really, really accepting. They were really excited to advertise it to staff. We had members of staff from all over the university coming and students, and that was really fantastic. So I think a lot of it now, as Avery said, is to keep pushing, keep going, keep answering these questions, keep campaigning, passing things on to the people that come after you as well, because at the end of the day, we all graduate, we all move on one day. We all, if you're a sub officer, we all, move on from the role, making sure that there's a line for them to follow, for the people after you to continue the good fight so they're not left in the dark is really, really important. But yeah, overall, I started university in 2021 and I graduated last year in 2024, and I saw a massive improvement in the attitudes towards LGBT people and LGBT rights.
Thank you both. Brian, what do you think needs to be done in order to ensure equity for people in everyday life or in organizations, so outside of university?
Well, I suppose what I'd say is, I guess, building on some of the things we just said as well. I mean, I'm old enough that for the vast majority of time I was in school, Section 28 was still in effect. So I find it is a lot easier to combat the harmful narratives, bigotry, ignorance, whatever you want to call it, when you can actually openly talk about it. That does go a long way. In everyday life, as Megan was saying, having the patience to field certain queries goes a long way, because while some people may not know the proper terminology, a lot of it does genuinely come from a place of curiosity. You would be surprised the amount of progress you can make with someone who might initially seem like a brick wall if you do at least just sit down, talk about them, make your boundaries clear, of course. You don't have to indulge actual bigotry or anything like that. But yes, just having conversations, making everyday people realize you're there, you're a part of life, there are lots of people like you. it makes all the difference in the world.
Thank you. My next question is, what are the main barriers LGBTQ plus students, especially transgender and non-binary, face when accessing university health and well-being services? And how do you think universities can ensure that their services are more inclusive?
I suppose one thing I had an issue with at my university was well-being teams. And like well-being is one of the most important elements for ensuring that university students are able to continue their studies and get to where they need to be. And not only in their students, but in their studies, not students, in their studies and outside their studies. When you're a trans student, if you're going to a well-being team and then you need to use your dead name, that all of a sudden makes that whole process a lot worse, because you're feeling sad, life isn't going great, and then you go to the person that's supposed to make you feel better and they make you feel worse. And so ensuring there's that process for preferred name provision, like with Megan and the communications, that is a vital part for trans students, because a name holds so much value, especially when it's one you've chosen yourself. When it comes to medical provision in universities, I know a lot of universities have a university GP or something along those lines. Those services, sometimes because they are new doctors or because they are, I don't know necessarily what's going on in those services, sometimes they're not the best trained on certain issues. Sometimes, because your general practitioner is someone who should know a bit about everything, that's their job. But sometimes at university services, and I've seen this across the country, you get practitioners who don't know what gender dysphoria is as a diagnosis. So if someone wants to transition, they need a gender dysphoria diagnosis, they need to get referred. But then this GP, who's supposed to know a bit about everything, doesn't know how to refer you to a gender identity clinic. And I think vitally in all of this, a lot of it is just educating the right people, to make sure the people who oversee that medical practice are trained, to make sure the people overseeing the wellbeing team are trained. One thing that I saw a university do, and I've forgotten the university, but their wellbeing team, whenever you submit a wellbeing request, you now specifically list your preferred name as a separate box. So in all communications with that wellbeing advisor, they are able to use your preferred name. So accessing those services, being able to have your identity fully represented and being able to communicate with someone as yourself and not another person, because it does feel like you're living two lives. Not having to be another person and compartmentalize means that it's going to be a lot easier to open up and to start the processes necessary for well-being, for medical treatment, for mitigating circumstances, for all of these really, really important processes that mean that you can function as a human being.
I agree. And I think a massive part of that as well is training the staff that provide the wellbeing services, as you've said. Not even necessarily to understand every little in and out, every nitty-gritty bit, just to understand the importance of referring to people the way they wish to be referred to, the importance of taking them seriously, the importance of not brushing them aside when they have issues either related to or not related to that. I think one of the things that I found in my first year, I went to sort of like a group session at the wellbeing team, and there was a person there who used they them pronouns, and I said I use any pronouns, and the group leader consistently referred to the person with the wrong pronouns, apologized every time and corrected themselves, but made no improvement, and at the end made a comment that, oh, I'm much easier to refer to because I use any, and that made the entire group incredibly uncomfortable. But that's just a matter of education. That person doesn't know how important it is to be referred to the way you want to be referred to. They've never had to know that. They've never been taught that, and they shouldn't be expected to just know it off the top of their head, especially because at the time that they went to university, that wasn't anything that was discussed. At the time that they did their wellbeing courses, that wasn't anything that was talked about. And so I think making sure that the universities are supporting their wellbeing staff to constantly update their knowledge, constantly update the way they approach issues with trans and non-binary people, and making sure that they're not always blaming all the issues you're having on your gender identity is really important. So I think any work that student unions and universities could do to help practitioners kind of get up to date with their knowledge is really important.
Thank you for that. Can you think of any best practices already existing in any university that supports transgender and non-binary students in terms of name changes, gender markers, or accommodation?
I mean, gender affirmation funding, it's great. It's we've already talked about that, so I won't explain too much more in depth for that. For accommodation, I know some universities, when they do accommodation, have sex segregated, so you can be in a male accommodation or a female accommodation. That gets very tricky, and I understand why some people require that, but making sure that there's clarification like provided, for example, because I have a friend who was staying in a university dorm, and when it came to, do you want to be in a male, female, or mixed, they were like, well, I identify as a woman and I don't want to go into the man's, but I'm biologically male, and so I don't know if I should go into the women's. So having the clarification of what a university means with accommodation, of, oh, we're referring to your biological sex, as awful as it is, it does make sense sometimes, and it's helpful that the clarification's given. Transparency is one of the main things I talk about when accommodating trans people, because I suppose it's in the name, but it's to make sure that we know what's happening, because when you just throw around male, female, it's really difficult sometimes to figure out, okay, do I need to be biologically this? Do I need to be biologically that? Do I need to have this identity? And then the non-binary community, I don't know how they cope with it, because it's really hard when male, female's thrown around, and then there's mixed sex, and then they're just like, where do I go? It becomes really, really difficult. So as much as my preference for this kind of thing is for that kind of gender segregation and separation to be removed. But in universities where they feel that's necessary, provide as much clarification as possible, and also probably clarify why it's necessary. Transparency is a big barrier. The fact that we aren't necessarily told why things are happening makes us angrier about a problem and then causes more conflict. The amount of times I've gone and done a campaign about something and then found out it's something that is actually quite justified and quite reasonable, but we just weren't told why. So always when you're doing policy, when you're writing anything gendered, when it's something that requires a life choice and requires an individual to make a choice, explain why you're making them make that choice, because that can cause problems down the line, especially if someone doesn't know why it's being done.
I agree. I think at the end of the day, informed choice is just the most important thing you can give to people. No one is being made to be in a single sex or a single gender accommodation. There may be some universities across the country where it's a lot more prevalent for them to have that, but at the end of the day, there are private accommodation providers, and if you really don't want to go into one of those, there are options for you. They may be more expensive, but this is often something that you can discuss with the university. But I think the informed part is massively important, the transparency, the discussing with them what exactly they mean, having customer service people from there that are trained in what they actually do mean by that and can speak to the students that are applying, and can answer their questions, can maybe even have a phone call with them ahead of time to discuss worries and concerns. I knew a group of people at university who were in a flat that was trans only. Everyone in there identified as trans or non-binary in some way, and that was absolutely fantastic that the accommodation did that. So every single person in that flat had put in their comments that, you know, they wanted to be open about the fact that they were trans, and if possible would like to be housed with at least one other trans or non-binary person, so they knew there was a safe person in that flat, and they were amazing with it, and they put them all together, and that worked really well for them. But giving them that choice is the part that kind of separates that from segregation. So if they weren't given that choice, if they were just put in a dorm all together because the student accommodation had figured out they were all trans somehow due to discrepancies with preferred name or gender assigned at birth, that would have been terrible. So I think, again, like Avery said, the informed choice part is what's massively important.
As an aside, full transparency in policy and practice just seems like a sensible way to approach things anyway, simply because false narratives bed themselves in really quickly.
Thank you all. My follow-up question is, does the panel agree that trans rights will be the next civil rights movement?
I think this is a very complicated question. I think for me, yes. However, I do also think it's really important to reflect on the fact that a civil rights movement isn't an abstract thing that's going to start without you. No one is going to start it for you. No one is going to push for these rights, and you need to be involved, even at the tiniest base level. a civil rights movement doesn't just start on its own, and it's not just going to be propelled by some invisible force. I would absolutely love to see the rights of trans people progressed in the UK and worldwide. There is a lot of issues that need to be addressed. There is a lot of things that we are going backwards on across the entire world, especially in the UK. There is a lot of really dangerous opinions out there right now that are directly affecting trans people. But as I said, activists are normal, regular people. They're me, they're you, they're a student watching this who's never been involved with activism before in their life and doesn't even know where to start. If we want change, if we want this to be the next civil rights movement, then we have to be the people that fight for it. And you don't have to be in a position of power to do that. You don't have to have a volunteer position with the NUS. You don't have to be a SAB officer. You don't have to run your LGBT network. You don't have to have a job that means that you can progress these rights. You yourself can make this change. You yourself can work with other people that you know to push this. You yourself can start a campaign to push this to be the next civil rights movement. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind, that if we want these rights progressed, if we want to push for better lives for trans people in every aspect, then that's something we have to do. We can't just wait for someone else to do it for us.
So in my like ideal world, this wouldn't have to be the next civil rights movement, you know? And that's why I pulled a bit of a face when the question was asked, because it's like, I don't want to have to fight for my rights, because that's, you know, an awful thing to be doing, because it is very draining. And it's like, why can't I just have healthcare within 12 weeks instead of the 12 years if you're going to Leeds or somewhere? I think an important point also is a civil rights movement doesn't mean that the whole nation and the whole world needs to focus on that one thing. Because right now there's so many injustices in our world where we shouldn't just be focusing on the trans community. All focus on the trans community is massively appreciated, because this is a fight we will have to fight, and we do need as many people as possible supporting us on that journey. But we also need to ensure that we are working with other groups who are facing barriers. You know, there's migrants who are being discriminated against at a very, very awful rate at a much more toxic level than we've seen in a decade. We need to work together as an international marginalized community, because, you know, when gay people were fighting for their rights, it wasn't just gay people who were fighting. It was cis men, cis women, and people who were straight, people, there were black people fighting that right. You know, black straight people, there were white straight people. It isn't just about your community fighting. So please don't leave the fight for trans rights to trans people. It's one of those things where we can all collectively fight for ourselves if we are happy to collectively fight. We need the people around us, and we need to ensure that these battles are faced together. Because, like, a lot of the rhetoric towards trans people can be used against immigrants. A lot of the rhetoric around immigrants can be used around trans people. It's like how transphobia today is recycled homophobia, which was recycled racism, which is recycled misogyny. You know, history has a nature of repeating these awful things. And so we need to ensure that if the worst happens and trans rights fall, gay rights don't fall. Women's rights don't fall. Black people's rights don't fall, because that is what will happen. It's not just us and it stops there. It doesn't stop at trans people, and it won't. So we need to make sure that we are, as a community, regardless of what your identity is, you are part of that fight, because you don't know if you're next. It's that popular, famous poem that's always recited when we get worried about someone's rights. I suppose there's not much more to add to that. I suppose it got quite dark there, but yeah, I think that's the situation we find ourselves in. And will it be the next civil rights fight? I wish it wasn't, but it's probably going to have to be.
Yeah, I think another important thing as well, I completely agree with everything you said, and following on from that, intersectionality within any fight for rights is the most important part of it. We cannot fight for the rights of trans people who are just the poster people for trans people, who are conventionally attractive people who quote unquote pass as the gender that they're transitioning to. We have to fight for the rights of non-binary people. We have to fight for the rights of trans people of colour, of disabled trans people. There is no world in which trans people have their rights where every single trans person doesn't have their rights. When we talk about women getting the vote, it was white women, wealthy white women that got the vote, no one else. That took years and years and years, and it came after. We have to make sure that in this intersectionality, We are keeping everyone in mind when we are fighting for these rights. We are not leaving people out. We are creating ways for disabled trans people to get involved with activism. We are creating ways for trans people of colour to have their voices heard, for trans straight people to have their voices heard as well. It's massively important that we keep everyone in this community in mind, and also keep in mind the fact that there is nothing, I'm kind of borrowing this from the disability rights movement. There is nothing about us without us. We should not be letting people who are not trans, who have potentially never even knowingly spoke to a trans person in their life, make decisions on trans people. That is for trans people to step in and do, trans and non-binary people to be part of those conversations. As much as Avery said, we don't want it to happen. We would like to just have rights and for that to be a given, but when you're part of a marginalised community, it unfortunately never is. And so I think all of that is just really important to carry on with us as we kind of go into this next chapter of hopefully fighting for the rights that have been taken from us back.
Unfortunately, I think I do have to agree to an extent we're there already. Our group has seen it personally push back by trying to include everyone. And divide and conquer really is the oldest tactic of bad faith actors weaponized against any minority group, and probably always will be. So yes, even putting aside matters of morality, which you shouldn't, but for a moment put it aside, simple pragmatism says everyone together is really the only way forward. And yes, I just want to echo that point as well. So much of modern transphobia literally is just 1970s homophobia with one word scratched out and another put in. It's really quite boring, if nothing else.
We actually had a drop-in session with students where this is how we got some of these questions. And one of the points that a student made was, without trans people, LGBTQ plus people would not have rights. And they were focusing on how we must protect the whole community. And having this conversation just reminded me about that. And that is such a good point to make. And that is so right, because when we're fighting for rights, we need to fight for everyone's rights. Because we don't get to pick who has rights and who doesn't. Because fighting for your own rights is difficult enough as it is. Because in an ideal world, no one would be oppressed. We wouldn't have to fight for our rights. But I think with the world that we live in, if we all just come together and we help each other and we fight for, basic human rights, then it would just make the fight more effective. Because it's not just trans people who should be fighting for trans rights. It's everyone, because trans rights are human rights. My next question is around allyship. So in your perspectives, what books do you think an ally should read?
I came very prepared for this question. I actually brought it in with me. So I'm going to say disability visibility for this one. From the title, from what it's about, is not specifically an LGBT book, and I want to be really open about that. But the amount of essays in here about the trans disabled experience are fantastic, about the queer disabled experience. It's so real and it's so raw, and it really, really echoes a lot of what we do. And I just think it's a fantastic book. So for those who haven't read it before, it's all entirely written by disabled people for disabled people. Every single chapter is an essay written by a disabled person about their own personal experience. And what I really like about this book is the fact that it gives you so many different perspectives as well. So it don't necessarily choose people who have one point of view. They give loads of different points of view, so you can take away what you want from this book. One of my favourite chapters in this book is this amazing eulogy of a Black trans man from the US who unfortunately passed away after a really short life, but a life that was filled with activism. And it was just really a call to action for me. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I'd said this book, as much as it's not necessarily specifically LGBT book, is amazing. It's fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough. It's edited by Alice Wong, and you can also find some of the essays online on her website, the Disability Visibility Project, as well.
So my issue when it comes to this question is that I don't read much. I'm one of those people that has hordes and hordes of books, and I buy books thinking, oh, this would be an amazing read, and then I don't read them, and it makes me, it's one of those things. But this book is what I've read. It's the conversation on gender diversity. So the conversation, they get academics and people who are trained to talk about issues, give an opinion. This is a very long opinion piece, but it looks into the history. It really addresses the fact that it is just recycled homophobia, and it goes really far into depth. It gives a historical perspective. It was written by a professor in history, so it's not necessarily, it's a really good academic read. It's much more of, I know a lot of people give recommendations from LGBT authors. I don't know if this person's identity, but I definitely recommend this if you're more into your academic stuff. Unfortunately, I don't know all that much about LGBT literature, but just read things by LGBT people. It generally gives you a good perspective on what's going on in our brains, because they're not all that different, but we like people that aren't we might not like people you expect us to like, and it's cool little stuff like that. You might come across a sentence or a paragraph where, I didn't think that way, or I didn't think that people thought that way, and it just widens your mind to the world in general, reading things from people who have different backgrounds.
I feel really underprepared now. I haven't read anything academic or anything to do with queer theory for a very, very long time. I mostly read horror, and far too many of us are living that at the moment. I guess what I'd say is slightly tongue-in-cheek, perhaps The Handmaid's Tale, just to see the horrors of allowing ourselves to be divided. But yes, unfortunately, I don't have much of a proper answer to that question. I do apologize.
I would echo that. The Handmaid's Tale is a fantastic book, and it's really reflective of kind of the dystopian future of where no one has rights, where we let our differences divide us no matter what they are. It's a fantastic book. It's very focused on kind of the result of misogyny, but it is so reflective of every civil rights movement, of what will happen if one of us loses our rights. It's a fantastic book. I would really echo that.
The point about, I believe it, if I remember correctly, it's anti-porn groups allying with Christian fascists that specifically allows the theocracy to rise to power, and that sounds so plausible it sometimes keeps me up at night.
Yeah, absolutely. That was, a really, really good, I think, point that the book made. I won't go on for too long about The Handmaid's Tale, please. I would echo that. It's fantastic.
An LGBTQ plus book that I've read that I think was really great was The Story of the LGBTQ plus Equality Movement. I don't know if any of you have read it, but in my attempt to be as inclusive as possible, I thought, okay, maybe I have these experiences, but it's always worth, going through other people's experiences and just trying to learn from that. And that was something that I found to be honest, I found that book really great, and I would totally suggest it. This brings me to my last, two questions, let's say. So what roles would you say that student activism and any LGBTQ plus society play in advocating for policy changes within universities?
I think generally the activists, the societies, they provide the most essential foundation for policy, because you don't know how to change your policy without knowing how the policy impacts people and why people want the policy to change in the first place. So when activists and communities get together and they have an issue with a way something works, coming up with the solution to that as a community, co-working together, collaborative work is so important. And when it comes to policy changes nationally as well, we are in theory in a democratic system. I won't put that view into here. We're in a democratic system where people are able to push that forward. So these societies and groups of people coming together with an idea, a vision, and something they want to change can change something. So it's that collective bargaining power these societies provide. And there's a network of societies across the country. I massively recommend LGBT societies from other different universities work together on like socials and stuff like that. You are allowed to do that, and it's really, really fun when you see people from a different university. So that collective bargaining power, getting a community of people together, whether it's a national community, a regional community, a local community, university community, that gives you so much power to change policy. And it's the most foundational step of creating any change in our society, to get a group of people that have that idea and agree with you on what needs to happen.
I completely agree. And I think even if you have never been involved in activism before, even if you have no interest in being involved in, the activism where you're stood on a stage, you're giving a speech, you're at a protest, you're shouting, you're signing petitions, just showing up to this stuff is more than enough. Being part of the numbers of your local LGBT society, of your LGBT groups, of your LGBT network, being part of those numbers shows your university, shows everyone that there are people here who want to make change. And that's more important than, I think, a lot of different things. Being part of that group is something that everyone should hopefully want to do, even if it's from afar. Just signing up and never going to anything makes a massive difference, because then those societies, those networks, they can demonstrate to the university that there is a hunger for change. There's an appetite for something different, something new that they need to be supported with. So even just by signing up and never going to anything, you are making a massive difference. So I'd say absolutely these groups have such a massive place in activism and in politics at the minute. And it's a shame that they are not taken as seriously as they should be a lot of the time, I think.
Thank you all. And in terms of activism, I mean, we would know that, especially in a university setting, can be very emotionally exhausting. So how can not only LGBTQ plus student activists, but activists in general protect their mental health whilst continuing to advocate?
This is a general life lesson I've learned that I think is so important. Always have a calendar, whether it's an app, whether it's a physical thing, whatever works for you. Make sure that everything you're doing now, don't be one of you don't need to be a kind of person who schedules their rest breaks and schedules when they're doing everything. If that works for you, then great. But all I have to do, I schedule my responsibilities. So as an activist, I might have a meeting. I'm here. I have this scheduled. I am going to be at National Student Pride. That's scheduled. I'm going to be doing a society event. That's scheduled. I even sometimes put when I need to plan stuff. So if I have to do some paperwork, I sometimes put that in my calendar. But that one's a bit harder to manage and track. Always make sure you have a calendar. It's a good life lesson in general. Being organized is great, because if you're looking at your calendar and you're seeing that you have like an hour of free time a day, or you in some cases, I've not had free time for like 2 weeks. And it turns out that's not great for your mental health. That's a really, really slippery slope. So the best way to gauge it is to ensure that you have a physical representation of your life. And a calendar is a really good thing to do that, because you can see, okay, there's no gaps. I put red for all of my responsibilities, so it's my calendar's full of red. That's a bad thing. I should maybe take something off. I maybe should step down on a responsibility, because I've got way too many responsibilities, and I will admit that. I'm still learning this lesson. So it's one of those things. But in general, it's good for life. It's good for your life to make sure you're organized. It's good as an activist to make sure you are giving yourself some free time. And the most important part is give yourself free time, because find friends that you want to hang around with, have some time to yourself. Whatever you need to do it. Because if you want to be a good activist, you need to be in good mental health. If you are burning yourself out by sticking to the cause for a month, that's a lot worse than being a little bit slower and doing that cause for 2 years. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So please don't treat it as such,
I completely echo that. And I think it's really important to remember that a lot of the activism that you do should not be taking over your social life, should not be taking over your personal time. If you need to, as Avery said, get a calendar, then please do. I made the mistake of not doing that, and I did way too much. In my final year, I ran 2 societies. I was LGBT plus network lead. I was in the final year of my degree and writing my dissertation. And I was also looking for full-time jobs and flats for after university. It was terrible. I was so burnt out by the end of it. And I had a 1-day gap between my job at the LGBT network and my current full-time job. It was awful. Don't do that to yourself. Remember that you are allowed to have days off. You're allowed to have time off. If you see, as horrible as it sounds, if you see a student that you do activism with at university and they want to talk to you about activism, but today is your day of rest, tell them that. Be honest and open, because they might need to hear from someone like you that it's okay to have that rest. And even if they don't need to hear that, it's still good for you to protect your own time. So I think making sure that you've got time to hang out with friends, go to the things you want to go see family, just read a good book, play some video games, have at least a couple of evenings a week set aside for that, and give yourself that time to de-stress. Otherwise, as Avery said, you're going to just completely burn yourself out. I completely agree with what Avery said about it being a marathon and not a sprint. You cannot and you should not be putting together comprehensive policy proposals in 2 hours because that's the only spare time you have. Please do a little bit, step away to have some fun. Do a little bit more, step away to have some fun. Balance is the key. For me personally, it was really difficult doing my job, even though I loved it, because I ran a social media account for it as well. And obviously everything I followed on that social media account was LGBT news related. And it was horrible, because all the LGBT news at that point in time was horrible. It was just about how we're losing our rights left, right and centre. People are dying, it was horrible. And I had to make sure that I set boundaries for myself as to when I open that account. And it's only in the hours that I set that I open that account. If I scroll and I find something horrible, I just stop looking at it. Because you have to protect yourself first. You can't help other people before you help yourself. And that's the most important thing to keep in mind.
I'd agree with all that. You need to know when to step back and look after yourself, delegate where possible. What I'd add is it's very important to celebrate every victory, no matter how minor it is. recognize what you're doing and take pride in that. It's, when you actually achieve something, it makes it all feel worthwhile. So don't just skirt over that and move on to the next thing. Actually take a moment to appreciate your successes. That's what I'd add.
Thank you so much for that, guys. And very briefly, would you like to give some example of accessibility challenges for LGBTQ plus individuals? This doesn't necessarily have to relate to higher education, but it's just some awareness that I would like to raise from this panel.
So, accessibility issues that we face in our community, like as a general. Yeah. One thing, especially in the trans community, is that I've noticed a very, very large neurodivergent community in the trans community, and someone somewhere will use that as a talking point against us. But it's a magical thing where we're able to talk, where we're able to think differently, and that kind of sometimes helps us along our journeys as trans people. I think making sure that if you're doing events for trans people, make sure there are neurodivergent considerations is always really helpful, because as a general rule, there will always be probably one person, at least in the room, who has some kind of neurodivergent condition. And so having that provision there is really necessary. So it's important to look at the demographics of the communities you're working with, because there are a lot of overlaps. It's the intersectionality point. It's that big point that will always be mentioned in these kind of talks, because it is so prevalent. It really is.
I think for me, one of the things I'm massively passionate about is making sure that every disabled person can access LGBT spaces. Fortunately, I live in York because it's a beautiful city. Unfortunately, York is incredibly inaccessible. It is incredibly physically inaccessible because the buildings are so old. It's so difficult for small businesses, especially small queer businesses, to get any sort of funding, to have access put in, to have ramps. The doorways are really narrow, and unfortunately, it's just a lot of the time out of their remit. It's also, there's a lot of cobbles in York, so it's really difficult for people to get anywhere. The university buildings were often built at a time where accessibility wasn't necessarily thought of. So that's a massive barrier for a lot of disabled people in York in general. And I think as well, there is a big barrier in the LGBT community in general for people with learning disabilities. Often people with learning disabilities are viewed as childish, or like they don't know what they want. How would they know if they were gay? But they're an adult, just like us. The people with learning disabilities are no different. They feel the exact same way towards other people. They can be trans, they can be queer, they can be lesbian, gay, bisexual, anything like that. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And I also think it's really important to ensure that we're giving people with learning disabilities the space to explore this, the space to explore how they feel about themselves and other people. There's a really, really fantastic organisation in Leeds that provides support for learning disabled people who are LGBT. And one of the things they do is they bring in people with learning disabilities and talk to them about their identity and the way they feel. I had a really good conversation with one of the people who works there, and one of the biggest barriers they face is the fact that carers and parents of these people do not believe that they have the ability to be LGBT. They just don't. They've just never thought about it, and to them it's a completely alien thing. But that, as all of us in this meeting know, that's just not true. And so being able to support those people, having the knowledge to support learning disabled people in accessing LGBT spaces at university, outside of university, social spaces, is just massively important. And I think being able to keep those people in mind will increase their participation massively and hopefully build their confidence as well.
An issue we occasionally see in the area we operate, as it's quite rural and a lot of our service users tend to be an older crowd, many of them have mobility issues, is whenever you're holding any kind of event or similar, choice of venue can be an issue. So many older buildings around the area aren't really built for people who don't necessarily get around so easy. So yes, that's just a consideration you have to bear in mind in general. Lack of transport links, similarly, as people get to a certain age, they don't necessarily have the independence to drive themselves, for instance, anymore. There aren't any really easy, quick fixes or answers to those problems, but they are just factors that have to be bore in mind.
These are all the questions that I had. Thank you all so much for answering these. Thank you all so much for your presence, and it really means a lot that you've all joined, and thank you so much for discussing these points. This would be everything. Once again, thank you. Really means a lot. But great. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us as well.
Very informative. Thank you. I learned a lot I didn't know. Thank you.
Same here.
Yeah.